Thank you to Rory, Casey, and Madeline for organizing this fabulous conference. I'm not actually a librarian or an archivist. I'm actually a communication studies scholar who happens to be working on libraries and other things related to libraries. And I'm here from Trent University, which is a smaller university just outside of Toronto in Canada. So I actually have to admit that in all the years that I've been studying libraries, this is like truly the first time that I've been I'm presenting at a conference made up of mostly librarians and archivists. So my bad, I guess. So anyway, I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm curious and eager to hear your thoughts and feedback. So I thought I would actually just give a little bit of a background to what this, what research this paper actually stems from and where I see it going. I'm a longtime researcher of libraries from a communication studies perspective. I've looked at libraries from all angles, historical, architectural, spatial, technological, educational. And throughout this research, I've discovered a lot of overlap between libraries and the natural environment, and mostly when it comes to their architectural form, actually. So in my more recent research, I've been looking to sort of extend my analysis of libraries to a related set of institutions and settings that consider other spaces of classification and conservation, a lot of what we've been seeing over the past couple of days, particularly those that serve to archive the natural environment. And so my aim has been to sort of take as objects of study institutions with different kinds of collections whose mandates and values, some at least, are consistent with those of libraries. And these institutions face similar pressures that libraries have faced and continue to face in remaining publicly relevant. And many have resorted to some of the same solutions, technological, architectural, and corporate, in order to challenge some of these pressures. So in my previous work, I explored sort of the emerging media ecologies that characterize contemporary libraries, and now I sort of hope to explore whether and how these same ecologies have migrated from knowledge institutions oriented to the archiving and circulation of culture and cultural memory to those oriented towards the archiving and circulation of nature and natural memory. So the question I'm asking is there in this sense a library ecology that pertains across public knowledge institutions that have not previously been conceived of as libraries? So as an example, institutions such as the Library of Water in Iceland, which houses 3 distinct but related collections of glacier water, an ice-related word repository, and a large collection of weather reports. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, which we've been talking about, which preserves duplicate samples of a wide variety of plant seeds. And particularly the National Aquarium in Baltimore is one of my current interests, which is currently seeking to become a full-fledged conservation organization. These are sort of 3 diverse examples of attempts to collect, preserve, and archive nature. And I suppose in the case of the Baltimore Aquarium, give access to this kind of archive. So in each of these cases, the concern to preserve, store, and provide access to fragile and vulnerable natural phenomena has prompted institutional, architectural, and media strategies that exceed the traditional models of natural history museums and public aquaria. So the aim here is to really explore and analyze those strategies and to ask whether in light of the kind of path-breaking reconfiguration of libraries as knowledge and cultural institutions in recent years, we can detect a library ecology extending across these otherwise distinct domains. So this is just some of the research that I'm doing at the moment, which I thought might be helpful to contextualize the more kind of formal paper I'm going to give about the Library of 2114 that I'll dive into now. So I wanted to start with a quote from John Durham Peters from his book, The Marvelous Clouds. History, variously organized documents of past time, is an apparently unique anthropological condition. Other animals carry their species history in their genes and have individual and even collective memories, we carry our deep history in DNA as well, but we also carry it in external storage media. Our nature interacts with our history. Externalization means both power and fragility. The leverage we have seen with ships, fire, and agriculture, sky media, and writing. The human investment in external storage media creates problems such as information overload and artificial intelligence. The bank of knowledge in a literate society always exceeds what any individual can know. The classical name for this condition is library. The more recent name is internet. So it's the end of his quote. So the 21st century library can be seen as an emerging medium that seeks to not only preserve and disseminate collective memory and culture, but also to provide access to spaces and networks of knowledge, culture, and interaction that combined renew the library's traditional role as a democratic institution. The library has become a central nervous system for new and emergent media technologies. With their architectural designs, programming, and educational practices, libraries tend to pull together increasingly decentralized networks and systems and create not only a place in which these media technologies find a home, a place where they can be contained, but a newly important semi-public space in which the encounter between citizens, public knowledge, and contested understandings of a common culture can be staged. So the contemporary library has been repurposed as a space that mediates human communication in a diversity of forms that depart significantly from the traditional practice of reading a book, let's say. The contemporary public library is not only a space of reading, research, or even of access to information, but also a site for engineering social encounters. So the transformation we have seen in the architectural design of libraries from, and this is a Canadian example, Halifax's newly inaugurated Central Library, the Chicago Public Library, to the spectacular, and I really love this library and I hope I can go visit it at some point, Liyuan Library, built just outside the tiny village of Jiaojiehe, China. These were all sort of built primarily to deal with space constraints, to either build facilities that could hold more books or to eliminate them altogether in order to put a whole bunch of other stuff in them, like computers and people, or in the case of the Liyuan Library, to put nothing in it at all but wood. So in fact, in the case of this library, and I quote, everything about the project from its program and position to the materials and distribution circuit is geared to creating a place of contemplative tranquility in deliberate defiance of the hectic pace of modern-day China. In other words, the Liyuan Library was built to escape overabundance and saturation. And here I use the term saturation as sort of this play on kind of the environmental aspects that are tied into libraries and library design. So we are, I think, or maybe we're not, you can tell me, beyond discussing the role of books in the library or whether or not the book in print form will disappear and so forth. So I don't really want to dwell on it here. Library is not just saturated with books. I mean, they are, but that's not the only thing that saturates them. So in this paper, what I want to think about are two connections that John Duran Peter makes in the quote that I read. The idea that our nature interacts with our history and the notion that the library has been the way in which we have dealt with the problem of overabundance, of too much information, of saturation. So the library, according to Peters, has historically been the solution to the problem of saturation, and in turn has itself been saturated. However, the library's role to serve as a holding facility of memory and knowledge has in recent years been expanded. While the term library, to designate the cultural institution we as scholars and librarians and archivists do our research and our work in, has over the years been modified to learning center, tech center, community garage, makerspace, and so on. The designation of the term library proper made its way to such institutions as I've shown before, the Library of Water, and the Svalbard Global Seedvault, although not called a library, is in a sense a library. So the term library is being used today to designate a related set of institutions and settings that consider other spaces of classification and conservation, particularly those that serve to archive the natural environment. In other words, the designation library has itself been saturated. So the question is, what is a library today anyway? Is it a tech center? Is it a learning center? Is it trying to be all things to all people? You can also tell me that, but probably. The other idea is that if we are moving into an era where nature or our environment is being classified and preserved in a library or in library form, have we transitioned into a moment where we have equally become saturated, although this seems impossible, or overtaken, if you will, not only by information, words, and cultural memory, but also by our natural environment in a sense. And yet, like I said, this seems completely paradoxical because as we see here with the Liyun Library and many other libraries have followed suit here, we normally turn to our natural environment in order to escape overabundance. So much so that newly designed libraries are literally making themselves look like forests. Peters writes that, and I quote, "Books are different from natural objects in that they can overwhelm us in a way that nature's abundance rarely does. There has always been too much to know. The universe is thoroughly baffling. When we walk into a bookstore, it is easy to feel oppressed by the amount of knowledge on tap. Why don't we have the same feeling in a forest, at the beach, or simply in breathing? There is more going on in our body every second than we will ever understand, and yet we rarely feel bothered by our inability to know it all. Books, however, are designed to make demands on our attention and time. They hail us in a way that nature rarely does." So, how then do we think about libraries as architectures built around particular, and here I'm adding environmental media instances? What happens to institutional process and architecture when the environmental media form it is supposed to contain is constantly in flux? So, Berlin-based Scottish visual artist Katie Patterson seems to be asking both these questions simultaneously. In 2014, and some of you may have heard of this project, in collaboration with Bjørvika Utvikling and the city of Oslo, she began an art project called Future Library. Future Library is an art project that is intended to span over 100 years. A forest with 1,000 trees has been planted in Nordmarka, Norway, in order to supply the paper to print an anthology of books that will be read in 100 years' time. I'm quoting now from their website. Between now and then, one writer every year will contribute a text with the writings held in trust unpublished until 2114. Tending the forest and ensuring its preservation for the 100-year duration of the artwork finds a conceptual counterpoint in the invitation extended to each writer to conceive and produce a work in the hopes of finding a receptive reader in an unknown future, end quote. So Margaret Atwood is the inaugural writer for the project and has already submitted her manuscript entitled Scribbler's Moon. In 2015, David Mitchell took on the charge of being Future Library's second writer and handed in his manuscript. And then in the spring of 2016, an Icelandic poet, novelist, and lyricist, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it's Esjon, has been named as the third writer to contribute to Future Library. And the handover is going to happen in June 2017. So Esjon in particular views the invitation to contribute a manuscript to Future Library as a call to play a very particular game, one in which he needs to address his relationship to and engagement with writing. This raises several complex questions as put by Esjon. Am I a writer of my times? Who do I write for? How much does the response of the reader matter to me? What in a text makes it timeless? As for some of us, it poses the hardest question of all. Will there be people in the future who understand the language I write in? It is a game I look forward to playing with enthusiasm and earnestness, end quote. So the goal is to have the manuscripts displayed only revealing the author's names and titles of their books in the new Deichmanske Public Library in Bjørvika, Oslo, scheduled to open in 2019. Looks very fancy. And the room they will be displayed in will be designed by Katie Patterson and will be lined with wood from the Nordmarka forest. And this is really interesting. They cut down an old forest in order to plant the seeds for the new forest. And I have an interview scheduled with Katie Patterson in June, and I'm really curious to know why they cut down the old forest. Was it dying? Because if it wasn't, I'm just wondering about the environmental impacts of that. So that's something we can kind of peruse. Although not initially conceived of as such by the artist herself, Future Library is an example of a generative infrastructure in the making. While it is a critical reflection and commentary on our old infrastructures of knowledge, will the book and paper format still exist in 100 years' time? If it does, will there be anyone around to read it, or will there be anyone who can read it? The project also poignantly highlights the relational qualities of infrastructures of knowledge. It emphasizes not only the kind of obvious, complicated transfer of knowledge and ideas within a span of 100 years' time, so one that has actually been carefully chosen by the work of human infrastructure, and I guess this is what archivists and librarians deal with, like what are we saving, what are we passing on? But it also underscores the complexities of having a fledgling forest growing within our contemporary infrastructural frameworks. In other words, the forest's existence is subject to whatever happens to our environment over the span of the next 100 years. Whatever political or economic decisions are made, whatever natural disasters it might be subject to, will have a bearing on whether and how our present ideas are circulated in the future. So in a film about Future Library, one of the project's participants says, and I quote, "That's what forestry is about, and that's what city planning is about. We are making decisions today that are extremely important for 2 generations to come, not for us only, but the next generations." Shannon Mattern, who would have been great at this conference, actually, she's at the New School, she argues that critical creative practitioners in particular, and I'm quoting her, artists, media makers, designers, critical engineers, digital humanists, and their colleagues, end quote, have a particularly useful perspective to offer when it comes to promoting infrastructural literacy, in that artists and designers, those creative practitioners, have the, and I quote, potential to become, to go beyond the representation of infrastructure to the design of infrastructures themselves, more efficient, effective, accessible, intelligible, and just infrastructures, end quote. It would seem that artists such as Katie Patterson are indeed tangentially taking up Mattern's call to think infrastructurally, and out of this to generate new orders of infrastructural possibility. While this is one node in an expanding network of creative activity that situates infrastructural concerns within our field of vision and action, I think it provides a hopeful gloss on Mattern's opening up of a collaborative and informed infrastructural design practices. Taken in the temporal terms of material infrastructure's Future Library and its full generation of aging wood, words, and spaces of knowledge preservation highlight how it could just be enough time for our ways of making knowledge, academic and otherwise, to evolve into an expanded field of infrastructural agencies, both the established forest of tradition and Mattern's new trees of change. So just to conclude and to wrap up, yes. Not only does Katie Patterson's art/library project illuminate, once again, the interconnectedness of nature and history, the seemingly sort of new trend of merging nature, the forest, and wood within the institution of the library, but it also underscores a temptation we have to possibly manage overabundance, our saturated world. In other words, Future Library as a generative infrastructure in the making, as a work of human infrastructure, could also be seen or understood as a way of guiding or controlling what gets transferred, but not only what, but how much of it. So perhaps Future Library is a library that, who knows, won't suffer from overabundance and won't cause anxiety over how much we don't know. Perhaps it is the library we strive for, the one in which wood can be found in more abundance than words. Thank you.
This loading here all worked correctly. enter notes. Okay, there we go. Gonna grab my water. Well, this is fitting because I would be happy to just put Chen and Matter in quotes on the screen for the entirety of my presentation and have that be what I have to say to you all today. My name is Charlie Macquarie. I come to you from California, from the Bay Area. I also work at some institutions, but they're not important. And the presentation which I'm going to give today is really going to be a creative meditation. So I hope you'll excuse that a little bit. I hope you feel like your time is not wasted. And if you do, come out to a Library of Approximate Location installation sometime and I'll pay it back to you. So what I'm going to do actually is creative. I'm going to speculate a little bit. I'm going to tell, I'm going to retell, I'm going to think about libraries, landscapes, the future, and the past. And I'm going to do this through the lens of the Library of Approximate Location, which is a project that I maintain, installing small site-specific libraries at various weird locations throughout the American West. Locations where human and natural histories kind of collide, where our endeavors are visible on the landscape, and where I hope we can be a little more aware of the raw materials, the supply chains, and the ideologies which are at the foundations of our lives and the foundations of our institutions as well, I think. And I sort of think of these as places where the layers of the Anthropocene, to get to this contentious geological epoch, might begin to peel back a little bit. And we can examine the actual stratigraphy. So this is going to be a report back from those installations and an effort to do some creative speculating about different ways we might frame knowing, frame using resources, and frame talking to each other about them. And I think it's important that this speculation happen in the context of library, in the conceptual space of library, because this is a space where the terms of exchange are already different than the terms of exchange that we're used to in the rest of our economic lives. A restructuring of these terms, I think, is clearly necessary. I think that's part of what we're talking about here. And I've always been struck by the fact that it seems like the library is an ideal place from which to jump off. And so in addition to that conceptual space, this library is an effort to claim some actual physical space in the landscape for non-commodified exchange, to practice the commons as both an aesthetic, an aesthetic, creative, and political act. And this practice is deliberately messy, it's deliberately chaotic, it's only loosely linked, and sometimes it's just kind of mundane and boring, frankly. But it's going to make connections that are pointedly weak, but that are there nonetheless. And I hope that it kind of posits that through these connections, other affordances and ways of thinking are possible. Can we speculate irresponsibly, but also from a place of emotional care and resource stewardship? Can we move between worlds at sites of opening in the landscape? And can we also have fun and see some interesting stuff along the way? And I think that too often we're sort of discouraged from pondering these questions by falling into thought traps, like that quote that I really love, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. So let's get into that a little bit and see if it is. So initially, the library has gone on a tour of notable holes of the western United States, from Mono Lake, California to Trona, California, by way of Tonopah, Nevada. We viewed mining pits and meteor craters, as well as the country's only operating lithium mine, the only domestic hope we have for all of our newfangled lithium battery technologies. We sought out all types of sites of opening between the surface and what is beneath. We thought about moving through these openings and arriving at unknown places, and we waded through foam, feeling along the bottom in search of giant pink salt crystals. My mother used to go this way too, actually. Along with the rest of her brothers, she would drive along Highway 6 every summer on their way to boarding school in Colorado. She was a quiet person, and so she would read in the back while her two brothers would fight across her lap. And one time out near Tonopah, the fighting became so bad that my grandfather reached back into the back seat and blindly swung, of course hitting my mother in the face. And this was cause for further punishment of the two boys. So he slowly pulled the car over to the side of the road, and right as they hit the gravel at the edge, my uncle, who knew what was coming, took off running across the desert as fast as he could. And of course, my grandfather went after him, and they ran for so long that no one knows if he ever caught him. So you should always stop for water in Tonopah, because you never know how far you'll have to run. Later, when this same uncle was older, my grandmother became sick with worry that he would be drafted and forced to fight in a war. This worry was so potent that one time in the desert on the way back to school, she awoke in the tent to find her worry next to her. It was a really hard, rough object shaped sort of like a brick. She didn't want anyone else to know about it, though, so she secreted it off into the desert and buried it in the sand next to a mallow flower, where it remains to this day. They launch missiles over it now. Can the library help tie together these family histories in the landscape? Can the stories of my childhood and the resources of my current life be more explicitly linked? Can the effort to facilitate these odd connections and new ways of thinking lead to new organizational systems? If the organizational schema for a family's history in the Western United States is a network of roads, what does that mean when it's time to build the bypass? To what extent will we labor to save space for the mallow flower? The library was also installed at the edge of the Carson Sink at Bravo 20 U.S. Navy bombing range, part of Naval Air Station Fallon, Nevada. They drop bombs there now. The fence is rebuilt, Navy jets fly low and loud, and it's hard to know where we fit into such landscapes of violence, beyond the fact that our taxes fund it. So at this installation, we walked for miles to the edge of the fence, brought some books, and shouted our passages into the void. Not too long ago, Joe Sanchez and Doc Bargan went for a camping trip in the Carson Sink. They left early, before the sun was in the sky, and they walked through the dark across the difficult way. There were no trees, it was only mud and rocks and craters of an immeasurable size, so big that you could build your house in one if you wanted to. They walked all morning trying to get closer to the Wolfe's Head, but it always seemed just a few more miles away. They walked past the sheriff. They walked past the men in helicopters holding signs that said, "Danger, go back." They walked until all the water was gone. They walked until the plane stopped flying and until it was quiet enough for some people to start listening. Now that people could listen, they stopped, and they camped for as long as was necessary. They watched the stars go by, and they watched the sun rise and set. They slept. Could a library hold the materials to reconcile our obsessions with technologies born out of violence? Could the library offer technologies born out of different necessities? As the layers of the dry lake bed peel away and the paint flakes off the rusty target vehicles, what kinds of new life could we find in other institutions like the library? The library also found a temporary home at the bottom of a hole, which was shaped roughly, which had the same shape as the state of California, roughly, and which was about 5 feet deep. The project was found to have no significant impact, not even on anyone's romantic life or on the carbon footprint of anyone's Spotify playlist. This hole was temporary. We filled it up with people reading books, and eventually it will fill up with bones or books or dead hard drives, and there will be no impact. There will be no hole at all. Sisters Ben and Tara had always loved to surf the web. One day they decided that they wanted to surf out the web at the farthest out that you could surf it, at the end of Windy Hollow Road, right by where the cables of the web came on shore and the data waves were the largest. They surfed so much of the web that they surfed so much of the web that the ones who control the data decided not to share it anymore, and the web dried up. Now the web continues deep underground, straight through their town, and no one is allowed to use it. Every year we get together to dig and dig and dig some more and look for the web, and to mourn. We haven't found it yet, but we'll keep digging. Are there alternative networks that we might propose? Are there places where the web might come to the surface? Are there slower speeds and better data? Can the practice of sharing common resources exemplify an information architecture of decency? Can the labor of humans and machines and natural systems be valued in such a way that our data actually reflects that? The library has also been installed most recently, permanently, maybe, for the first time at the Crystal Geyser on the Green River in the state of Utah. This is the site of the first oil well in Utah, as well as a rare cold water geyser, a stunning travertine point source of the highest levels of saline water contamination in the entire Colorado River Basin. This library is also digital, solar-powered, and shaped like a pyramid in deference to the larger Black Pyramid which exists upstream, a uranium tailings disposal cell for storing the unusable byproducts of the Colorado Plateau mining operations. That pyramid is a repository of radioactive dirt. This one is a repository of strange regional microhistories and local knowledge. A long time ago, not that long ago, but just long enough, people crawled all over the red rocks at Green River and took readings. When the needle was high enough, they would dig and dig and dig some more. They took all the dirt they dug and they piled it up by the rivers, and they watched little trickles of mud leak slowly down into the swift water below. Later, they dug it up again, and they put it in other places, also by the rivers. This time they covered it with black rocks and shaped it like they hoped it would last forever. It is a good site for growing melons. We don't listen to those people anymore. I have heard that accidents happen to people, but that what people do, we are responsible for. So these things human beings have done to the world must be deliberate and conscious acts of evil, serving the purposes of wrong understanding, fear, and greed. The people who've done these things have done wrong mindfully. They must have had their heads on wrong. There are many different kinds of repositories, though. So might we put the same care into storing our melon seeds and our community knowledge? Might we make the same maintenance regimens for our vernacular infrastructures and architectures? It might seem only gestural to think about these things, but as Ursula Le Guin reminds us, excuse me, giving involves a good deal of discrimination. As a business, it requires a more disciplined intelligence than keeping. Books are mortal, they die. Same with digital books as well. A book is an act. It takes place in time, not just in space. It is not information, but relation. So what could we do if we begin to privilege the modest infrastructures of sharing over the grand ones of collection or even of creation? This seems like an alternative practice an alternative platform where there is real space for expansion. And I think it's important to think about the library and its principles, the library and the archive, and its principles in this way as a site for expansion. Not just to think about how the trials and tribulations of the Anthropocene might come to bear upon us and our profession, but also how we might bring those to bear upon the Anthropocene itself, how we might take the library back out into the world and spread it around and make it work in other contexts and other circumstances. Bring history out from behind the fence, if you will, and intentionally link it to the commonly managed resource of our contemporary lived experiences. The existing infrastructure, of course, that's on the ground is massive, and its foundations rest on a logic that has become very deep for all of us: techno-determinism, extraction, and colonial exploitation. Much of the solutions we have to offer rest on that same groundwork as well. But though this is deep, I don't think it yet reaches the bedrock, actually. And still in thinking about this, it brings me back to that quote about it being easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But with a little jarring of the mind through the tenuous connections that are the raw stuff of creativity and of our professions too, I think, and with a little bit of the scent of sagebrush on the desert air, I don't think it's that hard to imagine the end of capitalism, because at the end of capitalism, we might try organizing things a little bit more like we organize a library, and we're all very familiar with that. Thank you for your time. I didn't even go over. I think it'll be fine because it is weird, but
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll see. Hi, everyone. Our talk is about, I guess, less approximate locations of archives. So I'm going to try to talk the least amount today, but our project is one that has a few collaborators. Tara Mazurczyk, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, she could not be here with us today. She fell ill, unfortunately, just before we decided, or we were to travel here, but she was hugely instrumental in the work you're about to see. And then my research partners in this project also included Eira Tansey from the University of Cincinnati, who you're familiar with by now, and Nathan Piekielek, he's our Geospatial Services librarian at Penn State. And most importantly, none of this work would have really been possible that you're about to see without Nathan and Tara. So this project grew out of an article that you've already heard mentioned today, written by Eira last year. Published in Sustainability, Science, Practice, and Policy. The article was titled Archival Adaptation to Climate Change, and in it she proposed that as societies begin to adapt to climate change, archivists should consider how values of sustainability and resiliency might inform archival practice. She and I decided to explore one of her specific recommendations from that article, which was to prepare a comprehensive survey of American archival repositories located in geographically vulnerable areas threatened by sea level rise. And this is where we've managed to bring Nathan and Tara into the work. So the problem we set out to address is which American archival repositories might suffer exposure to the future impacts of climate change. So other cultural heritage fields have begun to grapple with this issue, including built heritage fields especially, but also museums, as we heard mentioned in an earlier talk today. But to date, we don't believe that archival professionals have really considered the potential impacts, and the motivation behind our work is simply to better understand how what scientists say is happening in our world will impact our ability as archivists to assess, collect, organize, preserve, and provide access to documentary heritage. So disaster management is, of course, an area of archives and library practice that is closely related to this inquiry, but past weather is no longer a reliable predictor for future weather. And libraries and archives, keepers of our rare and unique material in some cases, need to have a better understanding of what kinds of amplified risk the future may hold. So a really great example of this that we've been thinking about lately or been exposed to recently comes from here at NYU. Jeffrey Williams, he's the Associate Director of the Health Sciences Library at NYU, has shared his library's recovery from the 14-foot storm surge caused by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And in a recent presentation, he's quoted as saying several times that what happened to them was a failure of planning because they had experience with hurricanes before. Or it was not a failure of planning so much as a failure of imagination. So you can think of our project as an effort to imagine more concretely the types of extreme weather events that may afflict specific American archive locations. We also want to say that it's easy, but not always the most helpful to think about climate change in terms of worst case scenarios. But it's important to consider that disaster is not really, necessarily the key threat that we want to raise here today. It's also a sustainability issue for our operations. So an obvious example that I'm sure you'll all be familiar with is the cost of keeping archival storage at a constant temperature and relative humidity for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in perpetuity, supposedly. If outside temperatures rise, the energy needed to maintain this climate will also increase, and so too will our costs. And it's not just the shelves, as has been pointed out in other talks, of paper-based material, but every digital resource we preserve is stored on a server somewhere, and that server must also be kept at constant temperatures, which is why you can find examples of data centers opening. We saw the slide earlier, Google opening in Finland. Facebook has their own data centers in the Arctic Circle now as well. So if collectively we can better understand the possible scenarios in the future related to climate change, then we can actually begin to plan and adapt and be prepared and not be caught by surprise. And I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon. Did anybody see that the National Weather Service issued a statement last night for coastal flooding for New York City? Pretty relatively minor. I think sometime overnight there were supposed to be high tides 1 to 2 feet above normal. That seemed like as nice of an introduction to our talk as not to Ben gave a great introduction, but that was also. So our methods were to identify the most likely climate-related disturbances, 2 archives under present day and potential future climate. We did this from surveying the literature as well as our own knowledge and experiences, and mostly Ben and Eira's knowledge of the archive and library field. To map those archive and library locations across the continental U.S. And this is just a 2-dimensional kind of location. It was a flat representation of these facilities. We don't know anything about, on what floor or where in the facility valuable materials are kept. So that's one qualifier you should know. And then go out to the world of geospatial data and find the best data that we could find to represent these potential disturbances to archive locations. So in general, the disturbances that we considered were those related to changes in climate, both temperature and precipitation, and then flooding disturbances, kind of more catastrophic disturbances related to surface water flow in floodplains, as well as sea level rise and storm surge. This is our study area. We considered just over 1,200 archive locations, again, limited to the continental U.S. It'd be great to expand this at some point in the future, but this was the initial attempt. These locations come from the OCLC database. They're self-reported postal addresses in that database that we geocoded to get coordinate locations in geographic space. Very quickly, no data skepticism is healthy. No data are perfect, including the data sets that we've used. And there's a lot more behind what I'm showing. There's a lot more behind this work than what I'm able to show you here today. So I always appreciate when a data producer also reports something about that data set's accuracy or confidence or limitations. And we've tried to we've weeded all that out and really tried to take a conservative approach of identifying risk of exposure to library and archive locations. A few quick definitions for future climate models. There are many global climate models, or sometimes called general circulation models. We've considered 16 here and spit back an average. We've also looked at range and other measures, but average is kind of a easy way to simplify it to a single graphic. And then we've also considered different future scenarios of atmospheric carbon concentrations. So these are just kind of different ways of representing what might happen in the future. And again, we've used 2. We're only going to show you one scenario, which is kind of a medium to high scenario for atmospheric carbon in the future. And then finally, thank you for the presentation this morning on resilience. That kind of justifies the need for this slide. Just to establish some shared definitions of these terms, we're using exposure here to refer to a change in environmental conditions. We're using the ecological resilience definition of resilience, which largely refers to the ability to absorb that change without an undesirable effect. And then vulnerability is kind of the combination of those two. That's really what we're after in this study, but it gets at kind of social and economic ability to cope with change, and that's not what we've done, but ultimately that's where a study like this would like to go. And the potential vulnerabilities are related to kind of unsustainable increases in operating costs and/or catastrophic flooding. To get straight to the results, changes in mean annual temperature is really about the costs associated with heating and cooling. So rather than just kind of report a mean annual temperature, we looked at maximum summer temperatures, which increase across much of the study area, but have the potential to be offset by corresponding increases in winter minimum temperatures. So you might end up spending less on heating in the winter and more on cooling in the summer. So we subtracted one from the other, and the places in green are places where the increases in winter minimum temperatures exceed the increases in summer maximum temperatures. So for these places, they might actually be saving money, or that's at least a possibility on heating and cooling costs in the future. The places in red are areas where the summer maximum temperatures increased much more than the corresponding increases in winter minimum temperatures. And so it is these locations, especially in the southwest and to a lesser extent in the southeast, where operating costs related to heating and cooling might increase the most. You can do the same thing for precipitation. I'm not showing a map of those results here, but summarized, some archive locations are projected to experience a decrease in annual precipitation. Others, almost 300 sites, an increase of up to 6 inches of additional precipitation per year by the end of the century. And this is good contextual information to keep in mind when thinking about planning for long-term sustainability of operating archive and library locations. To move on to the flooding, we found 30 sites that are currently constructed in a 500-year floodplain. It's possible that they weren't in a 500-year floodplain when they were built. These were updated fairly recently in 2013, largely in response to observations that the floodplains that we had delineated really just weren't representative of 100-year and 500-year events. For example, the areas of the Delaware River experienced a 500-year flood event 3 times in a 6-year period in the mid-2000s. So the term 500-year floodplain it's a name of something. it's not a precise thing. For sea level rise, we found 18 locations that are likely to be inundated by a 6-foot sea level rise. That's a fairly dramatic sea level rise. That's not we don't think will take place anytime in the near future. It's a kind of a beyond 2100 type scenario, although we're observing sea levels rising more quickly than we expected. Few locations are would be inundated in 1 and 3 foot sea level rise scenarios. Storm surge is largely an Atlantic coast phenomenon, and they're reported in relative to the different categories, the strength of the storm from 1 to 5. Category 5 storms don't typically happen in the northern part of our study area, so these data are from NOAA. They didn't quantify, they didn't run their storm surge models north of North Carolina, so that's why you see a small dip in the number of archive locations that would be impacted by a Category 5 storm. You can see many more locations are potentially impacted by storm surge, and this is present day. And then, of course, none of these disturbances will happen in isolation. They will, we will experience their effects in additive ways that we don't necessarily understand. One that we can develop better is the combination of sea level rise and storm surge. They will happen in a much more additive way than some of the other disturbances. And when you kind of stack the most dramatic scenarios, a Category 5 storm on top of a 6-foot sea level rise scenario, these are the kind of catastrophic images that you're probably used to seeing by now. But I want to emphasize that these are really detailed data for the whole Gulf and Atlantic coasts, and we have the ability to overlay library and archive locations, but also all kinds of other locations on top of these layers, and get an idea of what could happen in the future. So if you're not scared yet, this is the scary graphic. And I also just wanted to say quickly that what we call a strong storm now is also likely to change, primarily as a result of changing sea surface temperatures. And you'll note that the strength of storms are projected to increase the most expected to increase a lot in the Atlantic basin under climate change. So, to shift gears for a second, we thought it would be interesting to develop the case study that Ben mentioned of the NYU Health Sciences Library under Hurricane Sandy as kind of a test of our data to see what it would have said had we shared our data with managers of that facility prior to Hurricane Sandy. And Hurricane Sandy was a Category 3 storm when it kind of ripped through eastern Cuba in the fall of 2012. Thankfully, its strength dissipated substantially before it made landfall in the U.S. It hit Atlantic City, New Jersey, as a Category 1 storm, and in Manhattan resulted in 4 to 9 foot storm surge, but caused a lot of damage, an estimated $20 billion in property damage, as well as the loss of human life. And for better or worse, our data for a Category 1 storm and present day sea level did not predict any inundation for that location. We had to crank everything up to a Category 4 storm and 6-foot sea level rise before we came up with a result that exceeded the storm surge actually experienced during Hurricane Sandy. So we are trying to develop worst case scenarios, and even at our best, it could be worse than that. So Eira will.
Okay, so I am going to close this out on a very short note. So there are 3 things that I want y'all to leave here from. The first is that going back to this, first of all, we are planning on publishing this. We'll make the data open for reuse. But 3 things: location data, short-term planning, long-term planning. What really shocked me and Ben when we first started working on this is how bad the archival profession is about collecting data about ourselves. All this data comes from ArchiveGrid. That only represents large repositories. It does not catch places like the Interference Archive, right? So we need better location data. That's number 1. Number 2 is that a lot of the things that archives can start doing can be done on a local institutional level. You can start looking at things like the COSTEP model, which was developed to bring archivists and state emergency managers to the same tables, have the same conversations. But ultimately, this is the note I want to end on. This is something that's going to provoke some very long-term adaptation questions in our profession. We need to start asking a lot of questions. Not only our colleagues that work in allied professions like the museum world, the museum folks are way ahead of us in terms of figuring some of this stuff out. We also need to talk about what our colleagues in other parts of the world are doing. One of the things that we need to make sure is on the resource list is work from an Australian archivist named Matthew Gordon Clark. He writes a lot about what is going to happen to the National Archives of Pacific Island nations. What's going to happen to the legal access questions if those are transferred to places like New Zealand and Australia. And obviously we're going to have domestic versions of that as well. So let's try to figure out where we can get better geolocation data, because we can't do additional mapping unless we have better data. That's it.
Will my presentation trumpet? If I pull it up. Oh, it's over here, sorry. Yeah. Okay. I thought before I get started, I'm Mark Wolfe, and I'm the curator of digital collections at University at Albany. I understand it might be called the City of Corruption. They're wanting to build a museum there devoted to the City of Corruption. But anyways, University at Albany. I thought I would talk a little bit about how I got interested in this project, because most of this research is a few years old. When I was hired at the University at Albany, we're a place for librarians where, in order to get tenure, we have a tenure system. We're expected to do research and publish it. So it's a publish or perish situation. And when I first started, my idea was to do something that was sort of more archive-y, library-y oriented, which is good and important. But at the time, that was not where my head was, at work. I mean, still not there, but I was really interested in sustainability. So, but, wanting to get tenure, I thought that's completely out of bounds to do research in that matter. So, long story short, not that year, but I think the following year in 2009, I went to the Society of American Archivists in Austin and went to a session, something sustainability, something, along that theme, green archives or whatever. The first I've ever seen at, in archives, maybe it was sooner in libraries, but really, really transformative session. It made me feel good. I'm like, I could do this, I could actually do research, and make sustainability somehow relevant to the archives and library field. So while I was there, I had the great fortune of meeting Ben Goldman, and we were all both stoked, and like, this is amazing, great session. And we just started talking, and we really never stopped, over email. We just kept talking about a lot of the stuff that was kind of out in the weeds about sustainability, but I'd say, more than half of it was about the archives profession and, some of the things they just talked about. And so I kind of floundered for a while, and like, I've got all these ideas, and how does it relate to the archival profession? And the one I came up with is what you're going to hear about today. So in this presentation, I'll talk about the proliferation of information and how green building efforts to store and manage our historical records may undermine the sustainability of repositories and the physical environment. Archival institutions may respond to climate change as they do when facing tight budgets, doing more with less. Whether adopting efficient archival practices or building repositories with green technologies, sustainability efforts can be undermined by the effect known as Jevons paradox. The paradox occurs when Improvements in efficiency to a system or a practice results in an increase instead of a decrease in a resource. The paradox can also be seen in the advent of the PC and its failed promise of the paperless office. In addition, decades of inexpensive printing and the explosion of digital information portends an uncertain future for the sustainability of archival repositories. So here's some things to think about during the presentation. What does a Victorian economist and the archival profession have to do with each other? I'm going to convince that. Hopefully by then you'll be convinced they have something to do with each other. What are the problems with efficient archival practices? Could doing more with less be bad for the climate? How is efficiency an engine for conservation, but also an engine for consumption as well? What are the potential problems with green buildings? And can we limit our growth in collections and still attract patrons and funding? William Stanley Jevons was a 19th century economist. He was rarely talked about, or nobody really knew who he was until the energy crisis in the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo. While studying the economics of coal extraction and industrial consumption rates of coal in England, he made a startling observation. In his 1865 book, The Coal Question, he stated, "It's wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use, or efficient use, of fuel is equivalent to diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth." And this is what became known as the Jevons paradox. You'll hear it known as the rebound effect. It seems like each domain of science, when they find this paradox, they give it a new name because it's sort of slightly changed, but Jevons is sort of the originator of it. So what is the Jevons paradox? The paradox occurs when improvements in efficiency to a system or process results in an increase instead of a decrease in a resource. Jevons was seeing firsthand how the refinements made to the steam engine by James Watts made hard-to-get coal easier to mine. Miners needed an efficient way to pump water out of the deeper and deeper mine shafts, and Watts' more efficient steam-driven pump made coal mining in England financially lucrative. The steam engine also provided an efficient means for burning coal. More steam engine trains and factories brought better economies. Bigger economies meant more consumption of coal. Jevons says, whatever therefore conduces to increase the efficiency of coal and to diminish the cost of its use directly tends to augment the value of the steam engine and to enlarge the field of its operation. So in that line right there, you have basically what the Industrial Revolution in a nutshell. So modern examples of Jevons paradox, so we're getting a little closer to today. They surround us pretty much everywhere. During the 1970s and 1980s, this is when it really came to the fore. Conservation analysts made Jevons' work popular because they realized his work on coal could be applied to all kinds of efficiency and enhancements and the problems they could potentially bring. In combination of trying to save energy, analysts looked at what happens when new automobile lanes are added. The assumption was that it would reduce traffic congestion, but instead traffic increased. And I think we're all aware of that, and we know about basically if you build it, they will come. The more lanes, more drivers. And then more recently, Duranton and Turner wrote a recent landmark study called The Fundamental Law of Road Congestion. New roads will create new drivers. So Jevons paradox and fuel efficiency. During the 1970s oil embargo, new measures were enacted to save energy, like smaller automobile engines, allowing right turn on red at traffic signals, and reduced speed limits. Initially, it did help, but once the energy crisis was over, miles driven increased like never before. Recently, the advent of the hybrid vehicle design has led to an increase in more miles driven. Drivers, rather than giving Mother Nature a rest, found new ways to spend their gasoline dollars. So here's an idea I stole from Joseph Tainter. He's really influenced my work on sustainability. I don't use him too much in this talk, but this is something I've heard him talk about. So this was my line, what would Jevons drive? This is the idea, We have a Toyota Prius, obviously, on the left, and a Hummer SUV on the right. While the Prius would seem like the more sustainable option, the reality is that the Hummer has its own check on miles built into it. Its poor miles per gallon has, in effect, its own type of carbon tax built into it. The history of fuel consumption has been one of increasingly efficient fuel, each one yielding to more energy per unit than the one before it. For example, coal is more sustainable option to wood. It burns cleaner and creates less pollution per unit. This is something I've never talked about before, and this kind of blew my mind when I started thinking about when we talk about something that's more efficient. And I think Roy talked about this yesterday, about the change from using wood or coal from water power, and I'd really like to look at that and see if there's something similar there. My research on, so we're actually going to get to the archives part. My research on sustainability in archives has been largely focused on the failure of the paperless office. We have historical evidence about how records producers behave, and in turn, how the archival profession has evolved to meet society's needs. In 1975, George E. Paik promoted the Office of the Future. He was a Xerox PARC computer engineer who was working to realize the vision of Vannevar Bush's Memics machine. Through better computer applications, word processing, and intuitive user interfaces, experts thought the paperless office was just around the corner. Information and computer experts thought that the printing of paper documents could be slowed or potentially stopped altogether. Researchers in information schools got wind of these predictions by Silicon Valley engineers, and in 1978, F.W. Lancaster joined the rally call from business experts and coined the term the library in a desk. And this was in his book, Toward Paperless Information Systems. The failure of the paperless office and with the rise of the PC paradoxically gave rise to more documents, not digital documents, as predicted. Richard York, in his 2006 paper, Ecological Paradoxes, proved that Jevons could be used to understand how rebound effects beyond energy and efficiency and its consumption. He showed that developing one substitute, digital documents in this case, for another, paper documents, will not guarantee its reduction. In other words, a newly gained efficiency can jump from one domain to another and be consumed there. Slides here. This is a good one, though. I just made this one up. Experts were, so let me just back up a second here. I think I skipped Gordon there. Okay, so with Moore's Law, and I apologize, I'm a little confused by the two screens here. So we talked about the library and the desk. I want to talk about Moore's Law, and this is really like a whole presentation unto itself, but I'll keep it brief. Engineer in Silicon Valley made one of the most important observations not only for computers, but for modern innovation. In 1965, Intel co-founder Gordon Moore observed that the number of electronic components which could be crammed into an integrated circuit was doubling roughly about every year, maybe 18 months. This exponential increase became known as what is Moore's Law, and has everyone more or less heard of Moore's Law at some point or another? It's not really a law, it's an observation, just like Jevons paradox. It's not something like you can put in a laboratory, make it happen. It's really just sort of an observation. But Moore's Law is what's enabled the PC revolution, and to a certain degree, almost every modern technology improvement, from solar panels to nanomedicine. Experts were dismayed as years passed and still no reduction in paper. In fact, the opposite happened. Paper use increased like never before. Experts failed to see the usefulness of paper, and society loved and still loves paper as an information storage device. Xerox predicted the demise of paper, but at the same time they were building efficient printers and copiers, and perhaps Xerox and other photocopier companies were hedging their bets. Pictured is the famous Super Bowl ad. I didn't know it was a Super Bowl ad, but I do remember the ad. It's called the Monk ad, and it was sort of like a standard in advertising, like, you know, if you can top that, then you're doing something right. But basically depicted the tiring work of being a copyist in a medieval, monastery, and So this guy's been given a bunch of work on the right, and he takes his new manuscripts he has to copy, and while he's going down the hall, it's a modern office space, and he sees the brand new Xerox photocopier, goes in and gets all of his work done and brings it back to his boss, and everyone's happy. The failure of the rise of PC paradoxically gave rise to more paper documents, not digital documents, as predicted. Okay, well, we've read this one. Sorry about that. Okay, so here we go. Here you can see a couple who've saved so much money in new energy improvements. This could be insulation, solar panels, whatever. They were able to take that energy, that savings, and spend it on something different. So they've got a babysitter rented for a week. I don't know where they are. They could be in the Caribbean somewhere. But it shows sort of, again, how that paradox can come into effect, and we don't even realize it. Gerald Ham was a practicing archivist who was the first to bring attention to the mountain of paper records assaulting American repositories. With the 1970s as a backdrop of Ham's writings, it's no surprise that the limits were on his mind. Well, perhaps not knowing about Moore's law, he could clearly see its effects, and led Ham to coin the phrase the age of abundance. Using a Malthusian tone, he wrote, "One of the paradoxes of this information revolution is that while it gives us abundant information, it also creates an environment hazardous for its preservation. Taking custody of records became an increasingly costly affair, and the archival techniques of the time were not scaling to meet the problem." Gerald Ham sounded the alarm about the onslaught of records and the shortcomings of archival practices. The onslaught was most evident in the large unprocessed backlogs, which was building over a period of decades. Most archival description and arrangement was still often at item level, and by the 2000s, it was 51% of repositories were still not putting finding aids online. So here we have MPLP for archivists. Most of us know about this. For librarians, you might not, but I'll just do a quick little description. The problems that Ham spelled out were also compelled Dennis Meisner and Mark Green to write a new set of archival practices known as the More Product, Less Processing, or MPLP. Minimal processing had been kicked around for years, but Green and Meisner are the ones who sort of kind of refined it and made it popular again. So the idea was that you could process collections very quickly. And if you were to process collections quickly, what happens once you've moved all of your backlog into archival shelving? So adopt MPLP and the archival backlog is fixed, right? Well, I think of MPLP, and this is a compliment towards Green and Meisner, as one of the first sustainability practices created by archivists. It was a conscious effort to bring efficiency to the processing room, and also the harsh acceptance of the profession's limited staffing and funding. But once the backlog problem is solved, what does the archivist do with all that newfound efficiency or money? The processing room has more space, so new acquisitions have a place to be shelved. Directors will not want their resource allocators to think that they don't need space. With MPLP, it means fewer archivists can process more collections, both paper and digital. More digital collections require more data storage, and it goes without saying their carbon footprint will increase. This is pretty obvious. Modern archives require a lot of energy, a lot of embodied energy as well. I'm not going to go over that. Efficient or green archives, this is something I've talked about. This is all really good stuff, but again, as what I've talked about with Jevons paradox, what do we do with all these savings? We drive a hybrid car to the library. Does that somehow free us up to spend that sort of new green credits on something else, or do we put those green credits like in our pocket and don't spend them? Can we accept a no growth policy? Do we have some kind of rainy day fund? Do we invest in people and not things? That's been a theme in this conference. Can we think of some kind of innovative, non-consumptive oriented programming? So this is just at a glance here because I'm running a little bit over time, but again, the unintended consequences of green buildings. Greener repository space means that somehow you could potentially sidestep carbon taxes and therefore actually build even more spaces. As I mentioned, patrons take their green merits. I'm just kind of making that up and spend them on dirty activities. I've sort of justified my own kind of indulgence, if you will. Take hot showers, so on and so forth. This is a tough one, accepting limits to growth, because I'm not really, I don't necessarily think this is an option. We've never really learned to not grow as a profession, but really as a civilization. Growth is kind of how we do things. But minimal processing can't stand on its own. If you're going to do MPLP, you also have to think about what are you going to do to actually not have your processing room then fill up with more collections to process. Is there a way we could do perhaps traffic calming in our collections? Again, can the profession really choose not to grow? And that's, I think, really an unanswered question. Custodialism, I'm going to go very quickly, but this has really been the heart of the profession. We take custody of things and we put them in our archives, and librarians do it as well. That's how we think of really what we do. And so taking custody has costs. Systems thinker, I'm not going to read through all this, but basically his idea was that when we don't think in systems, we don't use systems thinking, we end up taking complete ownership of problems rather than working with the problem in situ. And what happens is we end up shifting the burden, which is the problem that's in situ, lots of complexities, and we take ownership of it, which is an extremely costly affair. I think of our custodialism as sort of like what we think of modern architecture. Lots of herbicides, lots of pesticides, lots of intervention in the environment that we still don't totally understand. High organization, and we put it in a repository. My alternative to that, and I'll be wrapping up here shortly, is that permaculture, which I think either Roy or Rick mentioned, is sort of like a do-nothing farming. I'm not saying that we do nothing as archivists, but the idea of these two modern practitioners, Mollison and Fukuoka, we just lost Bill Mollison this year, but they're trying to modernize what's been an ancient practice of basically creating the forests as farming forests. So the idea is that there's really nothing as a weed in the forest. It's a human construct of what weeds are and what aren't weeds. And basically trying to create environments that are self-sustaining. I think I'm out of time. Yes. So I'll wrap up with there. These are two guys I really like. I had a couple more slides, but thank you very much.
Can our presenters come to the front, and any questions?
Well, I'm really okay. It's not. I should have taken it off before I did it. But
so I love this section and the way it ended is just so outstanding, because I think when I go to city council meetings and so forth, I work in my community on the issue of fracking, and when we go to some of these meetings, we are sometimes confronted by people who say, "Did you drive here?" And the real accusatory thing. I mean, it's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate, friendly question, but not you can imagine. So what I want to say is that my response is always, that people need systemic change. Things need to change on a systemic level. And so I loved it that you ended on that. I think that's just right on. And permaculture. So you see me shaking here because of my Parkinson's. And I just want what you said about permaculture, right on, because I believe my Parkinson's is caused by pesticides. So I just want to say right on about permaculture and not using pesticides. And thank you so much, because I think that systemic level is so important.
Any comments from the panelists?
Thanks for listening, guys.
All right, thanks.
Wait, there's one more question.
Oh.
The last minute question.
On the climate models that were used for your talk about the geolocation of data and the such, were you using the historical climatology network from NOAA as your input data for the climate data on the National Climatic Data Center?
So you're asking about what was used as the current baseline
Yeah.
data? We use data from WorldClim,
Yeah.
and people, I mean, there have been lots of different approaches to this, but in general, they're all using the same data to produce a current day 30-year average that's normalized to the output of the future climate models, if that makes sense. They all do basically the same thing.
Yeah, I think
using
that
the same data.
the baseline for that is the historical climatology network for the United States and the global HCN. But it's they're trying to improve the resolution by getting more reporting stations for that, because in some cases, depending on your location, there's an awful lot of space in between one location where the data is collected.
Yeah.
And that geospatial component becomes very, very critical for filling in, I guess you would call them gaps in the computer in the model's capabilities.
The present day interpolations are much more fine-grained than the outputs of the future climate models. So that's really the limitation. We go through contortions to get the outputs of the GCM to be anything close to would be considered like management scale. That's just the state of the science, unfortunately, at the moment.
Yeah, I think one of the ramifications is that we saw in the past, 5 to 7 years or so, an expansion of the world data centers, which were about 30 of them around the world, now to the World Data System, which has, I think, close to 100, and they're more being added or considered for being added to that World Data System for that very purpose. The data's out there; it's trying to collect the data and put it together. And gosh, when you take a look at the metadata standards that are used for it, you're probably up to 40 or 50 different metadata standards. So there's the cross-pollination that is needed for that too.
We should talk more about it.
Maybe this is more a comment to Mark. I actually really found very interesting the way in which the entire presentation was about the problem of growth and this kind of growth mindset that where even in a library or an archival system, more space is always potential to be filled, and how it's always a conversation that tends to pit quantity versus quality of something. So and how that is so clear in the problem of libraries or archives or the idea of items that have value, and this kind of there's a very kind of easy connection with the idea of accumulation of capital as well. In, for instance, Bataille and the accursed share. Like, if you have something, if something gets accumulated to a particular site, if it's not circulated, then that same currency loses. It's almost like it loses value. It can deflate, and therefore you need to put it back into circulation, into something that again suggests growth. And we're kind of caught in that system. So it's very interesting when you showed this efficiency being literally a way of better organizing space. It leaves an emptiness, and that void now needs to be filled. And digital data is infinite now, how it can literally be, how it literally promotes infinity of production. So very, very, very interesting talk. I don't know where my where my question is, but I really, your presentation was super interesting in that the images were exactly clear about that problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank you. But yeah, the other thing on a more mundane, practical level is that with like ARL statistics, we're in an ARL library, so we have to make reports, and I don't know them all the data points, but one of them is just how many collections have you processed, how many have you required. So it's very growth driven, and how many monographs do you have in your collection when you want to get programs approved. It's all very numbers, and it's all quantitative, rather than quality, and I just one more little point, but our pound for pound, our best collection, and it's a little bit macabre. We have a lot of macabre collections, but one of them, we have a famous eugenicist, and he was practitioner of eugenics, and this one photo gets requested all the time, like almost every 2 weeks, because there's a big thing on the eugenics program, and maybe it'll play out and not get used so much, but it's like literally like 1 cubic foot of records. And then we've got these other collections that are like 200 cubic feet and more, and they never get asked. And so it's a bet, like, will it sort of age over time and become this fruitful collection, or maybe we're just going to be storing it in this expensive climate controlled repository for decades, and then just deaccession it. It's anyways.
I really like that idea about, like, you're bringing out the idea of like this vacuum or something that needs to be filled, because then we are also talking about the library that is like the curation of open space and not filling it with stuff. Like, does that even seem like does that seem like something that could withstand, like, when is somebody going to decide they need to use that building for something else? And could that possibly be a thing that is needed to be curated, is like the absence of information?
I think I want to write a paired article with this. So this paper, I was recently participating in a saturation workshop. So it was very based on climate change and the idea of flooding or also drought and things like that. It took place at UC Santa Barbara within their English Studies department. It was very interesting because it took place on the day that California literally got saturated with water, which was great for California, not so great for Canadians who go there in February to stay warm. But actually the workshop is it might be interesting to some of you, but it's gonna be part of an edited collection that's gonna be published with Duke University Press, hopefully, I guess, in the next year or so. But what I wanted to get at is that it would be really interesting, and this is something I've been interested in, is to do an article based on off-site storage, because the idea of this paper is really comes from some of the research I've done, or the research I've been doing on libraries, and the idea that the library as a like an actual specific place has really become a place for humans, for people to have a place to go that's free and where they can either be alone or with others, or do research or whatever. But we don't have a lot of those public spaces anymore. You either have to pay for them or it's the street, right? And so that's kind of where it stems from. And I think what we see in a lot of these architectural designs is this idea of like almost making them like indoor parks, just spaces where people can be together. And that's what's so interesting about, as well, all the collections. So where are all these actual like material things going? And that's where the interest into offsite storage and kind of appearing that way. But yeah, you're right about this question of like, can we really sustain that? Or, can we really call that a library then? Maybe it's just like an alternative space that we need to name something else, right? So, and I'd be really interested in just working more with librarians. As an academic who doesn't actually have a permanent job, I also need to be resilient. So I'll be actually at the University of Alberta for the fall, but I'll be at Dartmouth College in the winter. So I know that there's some of you from around there. So it'd be really interesting to kind of, do something together.
We're only 2 hours away.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be in your neck of the woods. So, anyways. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations, and I was really happy to hear that this group is working on some analysis of repositories in this country and what we can be worrying about and think and aware of. And it just strikes me that the project has such national significance. It's could probably become a bigger project and something that would be like the museum census and IMLS funded project. And I was thinking about the challenges around identifying repositories and using something like Archive Grid. This is inherently related to the challenges that our researchers have and standardization within the profession. And so it feels a little bit like a census type project to me, and like looking across repository lines, federal, regional, and then of course academic and et cetera. So make it as big as you need to get the data that we need.
So I'll respond very briefly to that, and Ben, I want to give you a chance to answer too. So part of the thing is that the data's out there, right? Me and Ben are just, and Nathan too, but you know, we're just a couple people that care about this. This is really not work that me and Ben should be doing. This is what our professional organizations should be doing. A lot of this data exists out in State Historical Record Advisory Board reports. No one's brought it all together.
I don't want to do it all.
Yeah, we can't do this on our own. I think hopefully we've just gotten other people to think it might be something they start.
I could tell you what tucked it in. I just think it's wonderful that you did something on approximate location, and these folks did something so exacting, and both are so needed. And I just think this is a wonderful model of people, sort of different, approaches and disciplines working together. And I just want to know if you feel that in your
Yes. Thank you. No, yeah, I mean, I do. I think that's what I'm kind of trying to get at with my project as well. But I actually had a question for you guys too. Did you spend very much time on like data finding and collection, or did you mostly just work from something that was pretty easily gettable, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, we actually surveyed, we talked to the Society of American Archivists. We dug around quite a bit ourselves. We tried to surface what data was out there, but it just seemed like the most complete data was OCLC's data set. It was also sort of geo-ready, I guess, the way Nathan described. But one other thing about that data is a lot of it's wrong. So as for the amount of work, I think a lot of the work was Nathan and Tara fixing the data, comparing it to like Google or OpenStreetMap, I think, and then also just running that all through ArcGIS. Variety of tools and all his R scripting, and so I think that was where the bulk of the labor on that came in.
In what ways was it wrong? I'm just really curious, like briefly.
And
Yes.
again, maybe this is more of a comment. I had spoken with a person at OCLC Research about the idea of academic libraries and shared print and mapping the locations where all of the big storage facilities and those kind of things are. And that was Constance Malphus, and she was interested in that idea. So maybe she's somebody we could get interested in this.
Okay, thank you all. And our lightning talks can come on down.